Welcome back to Outlaw Operations. Tonight, we're diving into a chilling case filled with deception, greed, and betrayal. A story that seemed to be about love and ambition but ended in tragedy. Before we get into it, take a second to drop a comment. Where are you listening from? And if you enjoy true crime storytelling, hit that like button and subscribe. Now, let's settle in and get started. On a cold, crisp evening in the year 1998, the small town of La Mora, nestled in the foothills of northern Spain, was about to be shaken by a tragedy that no one would ever forget. The peaceful streets and quiet nights were often a solace to its residents, but for one family, that serenity would soon be shattered. Isabel Garcia, a 17-year-old girl, had lived in La Mora her entire life. The daughter of a modest baker and a teacher, Isabel had always been known for her warmth and kindness. Her friends adored her for her cheerful spirit, her ability to light up any room, and her unwavering support for anyone who needed it. She had two younger siblings, a brother and a sister, both of whom looked up to her as a role model. Isabel was the epitome of responsibility. She followed her curfew, excelled in school, and had a strong passion for sports, particularly tennis, which she played every weekend with her close circle of friends. On the afternoon of April 20th, Isabel and her friends were enjoying a friendly tennis match in the park. It was a typical spring day, full of laughter and carefree moments. Little did they know, however, that by the end of the evening, their lives would be forever changed. As dusk approached, they decided to head to the town's only disco, a small but popular spot among the local youth. Isabel, always considerate, called her mother to ask for permission to stay out a little later than usual, knowing her mother trusted her. Her mother, Maria, agreed, allowing Isabel to stay out until midnight, confident that her daughter would be home safe, as always. The night passed, and the music played on, with Isabel and her friends reveling in the joy of youth. As the clock ticked closer to 11:30 p.m., one by one, Isabel's friends said their goodbyes, leaving the disco and heading home. Isabel, who had often walked through the same shortcut, a narrow, dimly lit path that cut through a vacant lot, was eager to make her way home quickly. She said her farewells to her last friend, and at 11:45 p.m., she set off alone down the familiar route. But something felt off that night. As Isabel walked through the quiet, empty lot, a chill ran down her spine. The rustling of leaves seemed louder than usual, and the shadows felt darker. She pushed the uneasy feeling aside, focusing instead on the warm bed that awaited her at home. At midnight, Maria grew anxious. Isabel had not yet returned, and the streets were still. Maria tried calling her daughter, but there was no answer. Worry turned to fear as the minutes stretched into an hour. She contacted Isabel's friends, only to learn that they had parted ways at the disco and that Isabel should have already been home. Panic set in. Maria's husband, Luis, a mechanic who worked late into the night, stopped what he was doing and began his own search. They were joined by Isabel's uncle, a local police officer, and a few concerned neighbors. By 1 a.m., after hours of searching, they decided to report Isabel's disappearance to the local authorities. However, the response from the police was disheartening at best. The officers at the station seemed indifferent, downplaying the situation. Missing teens, they said, often returned home on their own or had simply run away. They told Maria and Luis that they would need to wait a few more hours before they could begin a full-scale search. Frustration boiled over, but the family continued their search. Luis returned to the police station, demanding that more be done, but the officers maintained that protocol required a delay. With no other choice, the search continued through the night. Isabel's family scoured the town, desperately calling her name in the dark streets. At 2:30 a.m., after a sleepless night of searching and futile phone calls, the first real signs of hope appeared. A group of elderly townsfolk, on their way to visit family, stumbled upon a horrific scene on the outskirts of town. Just a few miles from La Mora, near an old construction site, they found Isabel's lifeless body. It lay face down, drenched in the rain that had begun to pour heavily during the night. At first, they thought she might have been involved in a car accident. The area, a secluded spot often frequented by couples looking for privacy, had seen its share of accidents. But when the authorities arrived, a much darker reality unfolded. Isabel had been stabbed multiple times. Her body, still in the clothes she had worn that evening, jeans, a dark sweater, and hiking boots, showed signs of a violent struggle. A piece of her jacket was missing, a clue that suggested she had fought desperately for her life. The investigation quickly revealed chilling details. Isabel had been attacked near the spot where she was found, and her body was discovered just off a narrow dirt road that connected the town to a distant village. Forensic evidence was sparse. Heavy rain had washed away tire tracks and other signs, but there were faint footprints left in the mud, ones that led investigators to believe that both Isabel and her killer had arrived by car. As the hours passed, more details emerged. An autopsy revealed that Isabel had been stabbed 21 times, most of the wounds concentrated in her back. The weapon used was a small, sharp knife, a weapon that seemed to have been chosen with care. The attack had started in the car and continued as Isabel tried to flee. Her last moments had been filled with terror. The police investigation seemed to stall at first. Despite the clear evidence of a brutal crime, they found themselves at a standstill. Who would do this to a young girl, a girl with no known enemies? The community was in shock, as were her family and friends. The family, devastated by the loss, demanded answers. What had happened to Isabel in those final moments? Was this a random act of violence, or was someone close to her involved? Weeks turned into months, and the small town of La Mora was haunted by the memory of Isabel Garcia. The search for the truth dragged on, as the police tried to piece together the puzzle of her murder. The answer, however, would not come easily. Isabel's case remained open, the mystery of her death still unresolved, as the town continued to mourn the loss of a beloved daughter, sister, and friend. And in the quiet streets of La Mora, the shadows seemed a little darker, the nights a little colder, as the memory of Isabel Garcia lingered on, a tragic reminder of the violence that could strike in the most unexpected places. In the quiet village of Grenshire, nestled in the English countryside, the body of 19-year-old Annabelle Whitmore was discovered beneath a crumbling stone wall at the edge of an abandoned orchard. Her death shook the entire village. Gentle, bright, and well-loved, Annabelle was the kind of girl who sent handwritten letters to friends even in the same town, who brought extra scones to church for the elderly, and who had dreams of studying literature in London. When her body was found, fully clothed and laid almost peacefully beneath the trees, the authorities initially hesitated to label it as a crime. There were no bruises, no clear signs of a struggle. A red strip of cloth had been pressed into her mouth, later determined to be from a cheaply made carriage seat cover, but beyond that, the scene looked too calm, too clean. Some speculated that she had taken her own life after a romantic dispute. Others believed it had been a secret meeting gone terribly wrong. But the truth was far more sinister. Upon closer examination, the town physician discovered male fluids on her clothing, clear evidence that something horrific had occurred before her death. The samples, preserved carefully despite the limitations of the era, were the first clue in unraveling the tragedy that had taken place. Annabelle's parents, Thomas and Edith Whitmore, were adamant from the beginning, their daughter had been taken. Raped. Murdered. She would never, they insisted, have willingly gone to that desolate place. She feared the dark, refused to walk alone at night, and was cautious with everyone, even those she trusted. Whispers began to spread through the village. Some claimed they had seen Annabelle the evening before, climbing into a dark carriage with red interior. Others recalled a strange man, blond and in his mid-30s, loitering around the baker's shop just before dusk, eyeing the young girls who passed. One woman, Eleanor Gray, said she saw a blue-topped carriage circling the village square near midnight, moving slowly, deliberately, almost as if it were searching for someone. The local constable, Inspector Gerald Penrose, initially focused his suspicions on Annabelle's former suitor, Benjamin Ainsworth. The two had parted ways a month before, and there were rumors of jealousy. But Benjamin was quickly cleared. He had an alibi and willingly offered a saliva sample for examination. The investigation then turned to men known by the Whitmores, laborers, merchants, friends of the family. It was believed that whoever had lured Annabel into the carriage was someone she recognized, someone who had gained her trust. But no match could be made with the DNA evidence. Adding to the growing confusion was a mysterious note found tucked into Annabel's writing desk, a scrap of parchment bearing the numbers 143-8211. Written over and over, alongside her name in looping cursive. Investigators believed it was a code, possibly a clue. But neither Inspector Penrose nor the scholars at Cambridge could make sense of it. 8 months passed. The investigation stalled. But then Edith stumbled upon 2 small, leather-bound journals hidden beneath her daughter's mattress. They were diaries, dated 1884 to 1886, chronicling Annabel's private thoughts. They were filled with musings on her favorite books, walks in the orchard, her love for Benjamin, and then, later, a growing fear. Toward the final pages, the entries changed. Her handwriting grew erratic. Benjamin's name was replaced by the number from the note, 143-8211. She no longer wrote of dreams, but of shadows she felt watching her, of footsteps she heard behind her on empty lanes. One chilling line read, "He says no one will ever believe me. But he follows me still." As the case went cold, Thomas Whitmore took justice into his own hands. He pleaded with the villagers, begging every man above the age of 16 to provide a saliva or hair sample. Over 2,000 samples were gathered, sent to magistrates for comparison. But the Judicial Council in London rejected the effort, citing concerns about civil liberties, prejudice, and futility. Not all who refused to provide a sample were guilty, they argued. And if the murderer was a transient or outsider, the effort would be in vain. Then came a break. A maid named Florence Hale stepped forward, recalling a strange encounter the morning Annabel's body was found. Around dawn, near the ruins where the orchard meets the old Roman road, she had seen a man, disheveled, drenched from the rain, stumbling as if sleep-deprived. He was muttering to himself, scanning the ground as if searching for something. He climbed into a white, aging carriage and disappeared down the path. His description matched several previous reports, including the white carriage and red upholstery. That testimony rekindled the investigation. A sketch was drawn, based on multiple accounts, a heavy-set man in his late 30s or early 40s, with pale skin, thinning brown hair, sunken eyes, and a square jaw. He wore a white shirt beneath a gray vest, and his trousers were stained with mud. Authorities distributed the image throughout the surrounding counties. Soon, more letters began arriving, dozens of villagers writing in to say they had seen the man, some claiming he had even lodged at their inns or worked as a traveling knife grinder. Later that year, further DNA testing revealed something unexpected. The origin of the genetic material pointed to a man of North African descent, an unusual finding for a rural English village in the 1800s. Investigators compiled a list of immigrants and travelers who had passed through Grenshire in the mid-1880s, narrowing it down to a few dozen men. One name stood out, Yusuf al-Karim, a former stable hand who had lived next door to the Whitmores for a brief period before vanishing without notice. A soft-spoken man, known for his quiet demeanor and heavy drinking, Yusuf had always kept to himself. His departure coincided almost exactly with Annabel's death. Tracked down in Marseille, France, nearly 20 years later, Yusuf denied everything. But a test confirmed what many had feared, his DNA matched the sample found on Annabel. And so, after years of silence, grief, and unanswered questions, justice finally edged its way into the light. Yet for the Whitmores, the answers came too late. The grief of loss had long calcified into something else, something cold and hollow. The number 143-8211 was never decoded. Some believe it was a code shared between victim and killer. Others say it was Annabel's final attempt to leave behind a message in the only language she felt was safe. To this day, villagers in Grenshire speak of her gently, her name uttered like a prayer in the wind. And in the orchard where the stone wall still stands, the blooms are said to fall slower in the spring, like tears from branches that remember. In the year 1872, deep in the outskirts of a quiet English town called Renford, an arrest sent a ripple through the local community. On the morning of October 1st, the constables of Renford, in collaboration with the French gendarmerie, apprehended a man named Elias Farrow just outside a blacksmith's shop where he had worked for the last 4 years. Elias had lived a quiet life in the rural French village of Bellevine, but the truth that had followed him was far more sinister than anyone there could have imagined. Elias was born on the 1st of March, 1836, in a small Moroccan settlement near the Rif Mountains. By the late 1850s, he had made his way to Madrid, Spain, where he married a 20-year-old woman named Isabella Cortez. The two lived modestly in a small quarter of the city, and Elias eventually obtained Spanish citizenship. Their life seemed typical, though not without struggles. They had one child together, and by 1861, Isabella was 5 months pregnant with their second when everything changed. Isabella's life was tragically cut short under circumstances that haunted the family for years. At the time, they weren't officially registered in the town where the crime occurred. Elias, employed by a merchant who transported textiles, often slept in the back of the trade wagon with his wife and child, only a few miles from where Isabella's body was later found. For years, the case remained unsolved. Elias quietly moved his family to France in 1865, where he and Isabella eventually separated. The separation was cordial, at least on paper, though in Spain they remained listed as husband and wife. By 1870, Elias had remarried, a much younger Moroccan woman who lived near the Swiss border. They had children, and Elias took up a job welding tools for farming machinery. Despite his skill, he was known to be distant, his temper easily sparked, especially when drink was involved. His relationships at work were strained, and the village women often described him as hard to approach, especially when alcohol was in his system. When questioned, Elias denied any wrongdoing. He claimed that 2 masked strangers had abducted him, forced him to witness Isabella's lifeless body, and made him touch her, threatening his life in the process. But the story didn't hold under scrutiny. His ex-wife contradicted this tale, telling authorities that Elias often went out with his brothers on weekends. One of his brothers had admitted, years ago, to having seen Isabella at a dance hall the night she died. She had shown up in distress, following an argument with her former lover. Witnesses recalled she returned later that evening around 11 p.m., laughing with a group of friends, but none of Elias's brothers were among them. Despite all this, Elias's former wife insisted he had never been physically abusive. However, she admitted that once intoxicated, his personality shifted, he could become mean-spirited, even aggressive. Several female colleagues echoed that sentiment, describing a man whose presence put them on edge. Elias had no relationship with Isabella's surviving family. They barely knew of his brothers, let alone Elias himself. On the 5th of October, just days after his arrest, Elias attempted to end his life in his cell but survived. When Spanish authorities sought extradition for trial, Elias offered no resistance. On October 13, during a preliminary hearing, he said nothing. But he did submit to DNA sampling, a new science at the time, involving complex forensic analysis. By January of 1873, the results were in. Elias's involvement was undeniable. His DNA matched with fluids found at the scene, evidence he could no longer explain away. He now insisted he had been forced to touch Isabella but denied any assault. The claim, however, was riddled with holes, and by the end of the month, the mental toll appeared to consume him. On the morning of January 29, guards found Elias lifeless in his cell, having hanged himself with his own shoelaces. His death marked the end of the legal process, which officially closed on February 15, 1873. Isabella's family had finally discovered the identity of the man who had taken their daughter from them. But instead of peace, there was frustration. Elias would never face justice in a court of law. They consoled themselves with the belief that justice awaited in the afterlife. Their daughter's name would be remembered, not for how she died, but for the long and painful journey to uncover the truth. Over a century later, in the year 2222, in the buzzing city of New Lark, another tragedy unfolded, one that would shake a modern world in a different way. Shadrian Tyrrell was born on September 7, 2197, in the quiet community of Green Bay, Wisconsin. His parents, Tanya Pinnell and Marcus Tyrrell, separated early in his childhood. Tanya later began a relationship with a man named Stephen Rowe. Shadrian's family was large and close-knit, with two sisters, Avenna and Soraya, and a younger brother named Bodrick. Shad was known for his vibrant spirit. He loved nature, often disappearing for days on camping trips, and he had a passion for woodworking that earned him recognition in his community. Friends described him as endlessly compassionate, always lending a hand when someone needed help. On the evening of February 23, 2222, Shad told his family he was heading out to meet a couple of friends. It was just after 9:30 p.m. when he left, and no one in his home suspected that would be the last time they'd see him alive. Sometime during the night, Shad returned home, this time accompanied by someone his mother knew only vaguely, a woman named Talia Sharp. She and Shad had dated briefly. Unknown to his mother, the two had gone down into the basement together. Around dawn, Tanya awoke to the sound of the front door closing. Worried, she called for Shad, but got no answer. She went downstairs. What she found was something no mother should ever have to witness. A bucket, placed in the corner of the basement, was covered with a cloth. Something about it felt wrong. Pulling the cloth aside, Tanya uncovered her son's severed head, carefully placed inside. In shock, she called the authorities, her screams echoing through the early morning stillness. When police arrived, a deeper search revealed more of Shad's remains scattered throughout the room. It didn't take long for detectives to track Shad's phone activity. That night, he had messaged both Talia Sharp and a man named Alec Grainer. The pieces of the night began to fall together. Talia was living in a home owned by a friend named Scott Harmon. When police visited, they noticed blood-stained footprints near a minivan parked outside. That led them straight to her apartment. Talia's demeanor was unsettling. She showed no remorse, complaining instead about the mess. She spoke of Shad as if he were a stranger. But when questioned further, she confessed that Shad had been her former partner. She said they met on the evening of the 23rd at her apartment, along with Alec Grainer. The three smoked herbal vapors and joked around. Eventually, Alec said he was heading home. It was late. That left Shad and Talia alone. From there, the story unraveled. Talia admitted they had returned to Shad's home while his mother was away. There, they smoked synthetic crystals and injected a sedative stolen from Scott's cabinet. What happened next remains hazy, even in her own telling. But the aftermath was undeniable. Shad's life ended in that basement, at the hands of someone he once trusted. The details were gruesome, but the intent was clear. Talia was arrested and charged, but her indifferent attitude throughout the investigation chilled even the most seasoned officers. Shad's family mourned not only the loss of their son but the betrayal that led to it. A life filled with warmth and generosity, ended in darkness. Though justice moved forward in the courts, the ache in the hearts of those who loved him would never fully fade. Just as with Isabella so many centuries earlier, the search for answers brought pain, but also clarity. These stories, centuries apart, now live on as solemn reminders of how fragile trust can be, and how determined the pursuit of truth must remain. In the year 1872, deep in the outskirts of a quiet English town called Renford, an arrest sent a ripple through the local community. On the morning of October 1st, the constables of Renford, in collaboration with the French gendarmerie, apprehended a man named Elias Farrow just outside a blacksmith's shop where he had worked for the last 4 years. Elias had lived a quiet life in the rural French village of Bellevine, but the truth that had followed him was far more sinister than anyone there could have imagined. Elias was born on the 1st of March, 1836, in a small Moroccan settlement near the Rif Mountains. By the late 1850s, he had made his way to Madrid, Spain, where he married a 20-year-old woman named Isabella Cortez. The two lived modestly in a small quarter of the city, and Elias eventually obtained Spanish citizenship. Their life seemed typical, though not without struggles. They had one child together, and by 1861, Isabella was 5 months pregnant with their second when everything changed. Isabella's life was tragically cut short under circumstances that haunted the family for years. At the time, they weren't officially registered in the town where the crime occurred. Elias, employed by a merchant who transported textiles, often slept in the back of the trade wagon with his wife and child, only a few miles from where Isabella's body was later found. For years, the case remained unsolved. Elias quietly moved his family to France in 1865, where he and Isabella eventually separated. The separation was cordial, at least on paper, though in Spain they remained listed as husband and wife. By 1870, Elias had remarried, a much younger Moroccan woman who lived near the Swiss border. They had children, and Elias took up a job welding tools for farming machinery. Despite his skill, he was known to be distant, his temper easily sparked, especially when drink was involved. His relationships at work were strained, and the village women often described him as hard to approach, especially when alcohol was in his system. When questioned, Elias denied any wrongdoing. He claimed that 2 masked strangers had abducted him, forced him to witness Isabella's lifeless body, and made him touch her, threatening his life in the process. But the story didn't hold under scrutiny. His ex-wife contradicted this tale, telling authorities that Elias often went out with his brothers on weekends. One of his brothers had admitted, years ago, to having seen Isabella at a dance hall the night she died. She had shown up in distress, following an argument with her former lover. Witnesses recalled she returned later that evening around 11 p.m., laughing with a group of friends, but none of Elias's brothers were among them. Despite all this, Elias's former wife insisted he had never been physically abusive. However, she admitted that once intoxicated, his personality shifted, he could become mean-spirited, even aggressive. Several female colleagues echoed that sentiment, describing a man whose presence put them on edge. Elias had no relationship with Isabella's surviving family. They barely knew of his brothers, let alone Elias himself. On the 5th of October, just days after his arrest, Elias attempted to end his life in his cell but survived. When Spanish authorities sought extradition for trial, Elias offered no resistance. On October 13, during a preliminary hearing, he said nothing. But he did submit to DNA sampling, a new science at the time, involving complex forensic analysis. By January of 1873, the results were in. Elias's involvement was undeniable. His DNA matched with fluids found at the scene, evidence he could no longer explain away. He now insisted he had been forced to touch Isabella but denied any assault. The claim, however, was riddled with holes, and by the end of the month, the mental toll appeared to consume him. On the morning of January 29, guards found Elias lifeless in his cell, having hanged himself with his own shoelaces. His death marked the end of the legal process, which officially closed on February 15, 1873. Isabella's family had finally discovered the identity of the man who had taken their daughter from them. But instead of peace, there was frustration. Elias would never face justice in a court of law. They consoled themselves with the belief that justice awaited in the afterlife. Their daughter's name would be remembered, not for how she died, but for the long and painful journey to uncover the truth. Over a century later, in the year 2222, in the buzzing city of New Lark, another tragedy unfolded, one that would shake a modern world in a different way. Shadrian Tyrrell was born on September 7, 2197, in the quiet community of Green Bay, Wisconsin. His parents, Tanya Pinnell and Marcus Tyrrell, separated early in his childhood. Tanya later began a relationship with a man named Stephen Rowe. Shadrian's family was large and close-knit, with 2 sisters, Avenna and Soraya, and a younger brother named Bodrick. Shad was known for his vibrant spirit. He loved nature, often disappearing for days on camping trips, and he had a passion for woodworking that earned him recognition in his community. Friends described him as endlessly compassionate, always lending a hand when someone needed help. On the evening of February 23, 2222, Shad told his family he was heading out to meet a couple of friends. It was just after 9:30 p.m. when he left, and no one in his home suspected that would be the last time they'd see him alive. Sometime during the night, Shad returned home, this time accompanied by someone his mother knew only vaguely, a woman named Talia Sharp. She and Shad had dated briefly. Unknown to his mother, the two had gone down into the basement together. Around dawn, Tanya awoke to the sound of the front door closing. Worried, she called for Shad, but got no answer. She went downstairs. What she found was something no mother should ever have to witness. A bucket, placed in the corner of the basement, was covered with a cloth. Something about it felt wrong. Pulling the cloth aside, Tanya uncovered her son's severed head, carefully placed inside. In shock, she called the authorities, her screams echoing through the early morning stillness. When police arrived, a deeper search revealed more of Shad's remains scattered throughout the room. It didn't take long for detectives to track Shad's phone activity. That night, he had messaged both Talia Sharp and a man named Alec Grainer. The pieces of the night began to fall together. Talia was living in a home owned by a friend named Scott Harmon. When police visited, they noticed blood-stained footprints near a minivan parked outside. That led them straight to her apartment. Talia's demeanor was unsettling. She showed no remorse, complaining instead about the mess. She spoke of Shad as if he were a stranger. But when questioned further, she confessed that Shad had been her former partner. She said they met on the evening of the 23rd at her apartment, along with Alec Grainer. The three smoked herbal vapors and joked around. Eventually, Alec said he was heading home, it was late. That left Shad and Talia alone. From there, the story unraveled. Talia admitted they had returned to Shad's home while his mother was away. There, they smoked synthetic crystals and injected a sedative stolen from Scott's cabinet. What happened next remains hazy, even in her own telling. But the aftermath was undeniable. Shad's life ended in that basement, at the hands of someone he once trusted. The details were gruesome, but the intent was clear. Talia was arrested and charged, but her indifferent attitude throughout the investigation chilled even the most seasoned officers. Shad's family mourned not only the loss of their son but the betrayal that led to it. A life filled with warmth and generosity, ended in darkness. Though justice moved forward in the courts, the ache in the hearts of those who loved him would never fully fade. Just as with Isabella so many centuries earlier, the search for answers brought pain, but also clarity. These stories, centuries apart, now live on as solemn reminders of how fragile trust can be, and how determined the pursuit of truth must remain. It was the year 1893 in the quiet industrial town of Millhaven, tucked in the outskirts of Yorkshire. The soot-covered cobbled streets bore witness to stories both mundane and monstrous. Among the tales whispered between factory workers and barmaids, few were as chilling as the one that unraveled inside a modest brick house on Mournfield Lane. Eleanor Marchand had always been a peculiar woman. With dark, glassy eyes and an air of detachment, she walked through life like a ghost tethered to the world by only the thinnest of strings. Those who knew her spoke of her brilliance and charm, but also of the shadows that followed her, subtle signs of a life riddled with internal battles, impulsive decisions, and an unquenchable thirst for chaos. That winter night, Eleanor was not herself, or perhaps she was entirely herself. She had been drinking again, more than usual, and partaking in the powders and potions traded behind back doors in town, whispered about in hushed tones. When Constable Harland brought her in for questioning, it was immediately clear that she was under the influence, her gaze distant, her movements erratic, but her words sharp as ever. Despite her altered state, the questioning continued. Harland had no time for patience. Eleanor confessed almost casually that her former lover, Alastair Dunn, lay in pieces in the root cellar beneath her home. It was as if she were sharing news of a lost heirloom, not the brutal dismemberment of a man she once professed to love. When pressed further, Eleanor's story became fragmented. She claimed she couldn't remember much after the drink and the smoke took hold, said she had blacked out, that her mind had become a fog. Yet, as the interrogation continued, it became clear that her memory was selective. The parts she did recall, she shared with unsettling clarity. She spoke of intimacy, of that night spent tangled in bedsheets and bindings. She admitted to using props, chains, and a steel collar they kept hidden in a locked wooden trunk. Alistair, she claimed, enjoyed the intensity. So did she. But as her voice grew softer, she confessed that her desire for control had begun to eclipse their shared fantasies. That night, she said, something in her shifted. Eleanor described the moment with eerie calm. She had tightened the chain, at first playfully, then deliberately, watching the life slip from Alistair's eyes. Her words lacked remorse. Instead, there was something disturbingly close to pride. When asked why she continued even after he stopped breathing, she replied with a shrug and a chilling smile, "I loved him too much to let him go." Detective Harland kept pressing. What had she done next? Where were the rest of the remains? Eleanor sighed, as though exhausted by the conversation. She admitted that parts of Alistair's body were left in the cellar, others hidden in a battered carriage she kept behind the house. She hadn't thought to move everything. "I got lazy," she said simply. Harland noted her lack of emotion. No tears, no trembling hands, just a woman recounting something grotesque with the ease of discussing the weather. She even laughed, more than once, particularly when describing how she had attempted to carry Alistair's severed head but left it behind by accident. That, she said, was her biggest mistake, not the murder, but the oversight. At one point, she confessed to watching his organs spill out as she worked with kitchen knives. She said it fascinated her. She claimed she felt peace while cleaning up, a strange tranquility that replaced the panic one might expect. It wasn't until later that the frustration crept in, frustration that the process had taken longer than she wanted, that it had been messier than she anticipated. When Harland asked if she had planned to kill Alistair from the start, Eleanor shook her head. "Not at first," she said. "But it felt right once it began. It wasn't just the murder that horrified the townspeople. It was what followed." Eleanor admitted to continuing their intimacy after death. She described the act in clinical detail, her tone disturbingly calm. She showed no shame, only regret that she hadn't numbed herself afterward with more opium. "I should have taken something," she muttered. "It might have made it easier to sleep." Her moments of what might have been guilt came and went like passing clouds. Once, she said she thought about calling for help. But the thought left as quickly as it arrived, smothered by irrational ideas and the haze of whatever she'd inhaled. At no point did she claim to be possessed, or unaware of her actions. If anything, she admitted to knowing precisely what she was doing, and enjoying it. Later, as Harland continued his inquiries, Eleanor gave a disturbingly vivid recount of the dismemberment. Her tone had shifted again, not boastful, not regretful, just matter-of-fact. She described the tools she used, the motions, how Alistair's body responded with each cut. It was less a confession and more a reenactment. A performance, almost. Eleanor Marchand had been born in the autumn of 1865, the youngest daughter of a candle maker and a seamstress. She was clever from the start, sharp-tongued, imaginative, with a curiosity that often tipped into something darker. She married young, to a man named Wallace Granger, a dockworker who disappeared under strange circumstances not long after the birth of their son, Thomas. Rumors had circled then, too, but nothing ever came of them. It was her relationship with Alistair Dunn, a soft-spoken carriage builder from the coast, that brought her back into the public eye. Alistair, quiet and kind, was the sort few noticed, but Eleanor had noticed him. And what began as a passionate, all-consuming affair ended with blood on the floor and a community left shattered by the revelation. Psychiatrists brought in to assess Eleanor found themselves split. Some claimed she suffered from severe psychosis, others said she was fully aware of her actions and simply lacked empathy. Regardless, she remained cold and calculated in every interview. The closest she came to sorrow was not for the loss of life, but for the failure to execute her plan as she had intended. When asked what she would do differently, she paused, then replied, "I'd have brought his head with me. That would have made all the difference." As Harland left the room that final night, he looked back one last time. Eleanor was smiling faintly to herself, eyes half closed, humming an old lullaby from her childhood. And outside, the town of Millhaven slept uneasily, forever changed by the horrors hidden in that brick house on Mournfield Lane. There's a chilling kind of empathy in people like Eleanor, people who can look you in the eyes, smile, earn your trust, and then carve you into pieces. It makes you wonder how monsters are made. Are they born cruel, or built from neglect and broken homes? In Eleanor's case, it was a little of both. Her past was a patchwork of frayed family ties and empty parental guidance, a recipe that brewed a storm in silence. Let's go back in time, not too far, but far enough to a different place and a different century. It was the fall of 1896, in the quiet town of Larkspur, tucked somewhere between the foggy valleys of old New England. Most of the townsfolk lived ordinary lives, cobblestone streets, candlelit windows, and church bells that rang like clockwork. But beneath all that, something sinister was about to surface. On the evening of October 23rd, the workers at a telegraph and communications office nestled atop a 7-story building were handling the graveyard shift. The wind howled outside, and the ticking of the wall clock echoed through the halls. Around 11:45 p.m., a security watchman, coat soaked from the drizzle outside, stepped into the hallway and approached one of the senior clerks, a man who went by the name Jonathan Bell. He whispered that 2 men were waiting for him in the parlor. Jonathan blinked, confused. Who could be visiting him at this hour? No one he knew had ever dared to come by so late. Something didn't sit right, but curiosity tugged at him. He made his way down the creaky hallway to the parlor, where 2 tall men in overcoats stood by the fire. As he approached, one extended his hand. "Evening, Mr. Elias." Jonathan froze. That name. Elias. He hadn't heard it in over 16 years. It was a name buried in a past he had desperately tried to erase. Not even his wife or children knew who Elias really was. His hands trembled as he reached out. The man shook his hand firmly and looked him in the eyes. "You've run long enough. It's time to come home." Jonathan, or Elias, rather, didn't resist. The 2 men were investigators, and by dawn on October 24th, he was escorted quietly back to the city of Eastmere. The telegram sent that morning to the chief constable read only, "We have him." Elias sat silently, his mind drifting back, trying to piece together how they had finally found him after all these years. To understand that, you'd have to rewind the clock all the way back to February 14, 1880. That's when it all began. Elias, back then a school sports instructor in Eastmere, had married a quiet bank clerk named Annalise just 3 months prior. It was an arranged marriage, the kind stitched together by family hopes and expectations rather than love. They lived in a modest apartment on Briar Street. Every time Elias had to travel for sports meets, he insisted Annalise go stay with her father in Ashfield, citing that their neighborhood had been hit by a series of thefts. Annalise complied, not wanting to argue, and the visits to her father's home became routine. But on February 5th, something shifted. That day, she arrived at her father's door and asked for a few coins to fuel the carriage. Her father, slightly puzzled, asked if Elias wasn't providing for her. She looked tired. Upset. She brushed off the question with a weak smile and walked away. It was the last time her father saw her alive. 9 days later, on Valentine's evening, Annalise had a short chat with her sister over the phone line, lasting no more than 15 minutes. Just 2 hours later, Elias sent a frantic message to her father, begging him to rush to the Eastmere General Infirmary. By the time they arrived, it was too late. Annalise was dead. The doctor said she'd been strangled with a silken scarf. Elias was slumped in a corner, shaking with grief, his face buried in his palms. He told the constables that their home had been broken into, that thieves had stolen jewelry and ransacked their belongings. Maybe they'd even attacked Annalise, he said. The police took his statement and didn't question it much. After all, he looked devastated. His health began to deteriorate, and within hours, he was admitted to the same hospital where his wife lay cold in the morgue. 2 days passed. Then, a call came into the constabulary from Elias's elder brother. Elias had vanished. He'd escaped the hospital in the middle of the night. No one had seen him leave. The town was stunned. The police, who had sympathized with the grief-stricken husband, were now suspicious. The same man they saw weeping at his wife's bedside had vanished without a trace. Annalise's family was livid. The townsfolk were restless. Rumors swirled, and soon, the story reached the papers. Pressure mounted on law enforcement. Search teams were dispatched. Roadblocks were set. Notices went up on every tavern and church wall. A reward of 1,000 crowns was offered for any information about Elias. But no one came forward. Days turned into months. Months into years. Slowly, the case grew cold. The whispers faded. But Annalise's family never stopped digging. Eventually, a few years later, one of the investigators managed to trace a trail back to a woman Elias had been secretly involved with, a woman who lived on the outskirts of town. Their affair had begun even before Elias's marriage. What's more disturbing, investigators found letters, ones that hinted Elias had been planning to free himself from the marriage. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. The fake burglary. The scarf. The lies. But Elias had vanished into the wind, until that October night, 16 years later, when two strangers in coats stood in a parlor and called him by a name he thought he had buried forever. Sometimes the past doesn't knock when it comes back, it kicks the door wide open. And monsters like Eleanor or Elias, they're never born out of nowhere. They're built over time, quietly, in broken homes, in empty rooms where no one listens, where no one cares, until someone ends up dead. In the winter of 1872, in a quiet part of Yorkshire, Eleanor received a peculiar letter. It was from Gregory Hale, a man she had once known intimately. In it, he proposed marriage. But by that time, Eleanor had already heard the dreadful news: Benjamin, her childhood friend, was dead. The news struck her like a thunderclap. And now here was Gregory, the very man rumored to be connected to that same grim affair, asking for her hand. She refused without hesitation. She couldn't fathom tying her life to someone whispered to be involved in murder. After that day, Eleanor never heard from Gregory again. Time moved on, and so did the townspeople, though the shadows of that winter evening lingered like a fog that never quite lifted. 6 long years drifted by. No word. No sightings. The local constables had never formally closed the case, keeping a watchful eye on Gregory's kin, suspecting he might someday return. But he didn't. Not once did he send word, not even to his aging parents in Lancashire. Then something strange happened. In February of 1878, word came to the station in York that Gregory had been seen visiting his parents, but not in Lancashire. The visit took place in a modest cottage near the border of Cumbria. One day after the visit, his father passed away under what the doctors called natural causes, but the timing unsettled the few who knew the backstory. Naturally, the constables assumed Gregory might return for the burial. He did not. Interest in the case waned over time, buried under newer crimes and fresher tragedies. But in early 1884, a fresh-faced inspector named Harold Blackthorne joined the force and began poring over old files. The Hale case intrigued him, the disappearance, the rumors, the unanswered questions. Harold asked the station for updates. They told him what little they knew: the father had died, the mother now lived in an old stone house in a rural part of Derbyshire, mostly bedridden. Gregory's only brother had long since moved to Edinburgh and claimed no contact with him. Harold wasn't satisfied. With quiet resolve, he launched a quiet surveillance of the mother's house. Officers dressed in humble clothes took turns watching the place from a distance, noting any visitors, callers, or suspicious activity. For weeks, nothing happened. The house remained still. The only movement was the occasional nurse or delivery boy. Running out of options, Harold reached out to Eleanor. She was now married, with a different life in Leeds. She confessed that she hadn't spoken to Gregory since that disturbing letter 6 years ago. But something new emerged. Just a few months ago, some old acquaintances told her they saw a man in a shopping hall in London who looked uncannily like Gregory. She didn't think much of it at the time, but now, recalling the detail, she mentioned the specific arcade where he was supposedly seen. With that sliver of hope, a small team was dispatched to London. They examined every bit of footage from the arcade surveillance system. Days of grainy reels. Dozens of faces. Nothing definitive. Just as disappointment began to settle in, the team received more tips: sightings in Bristol, a man in Glasgow asking odd questions, someone in Norwich who fit the description. Could Gregory be moving place to place, blending into the crowd? Inspector Harold began piecing together phone records, in their time, messages and telegram logs, sent to and from Gregory's family. Over 3,000 contacts reviewed. So many names, so many dead ends. But Harold wasn't the type to quit. He believed, with a quiet conviction, that Gregory had not vanished. He was out there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the world to forget. Then, something. A call came in to Gregory's mother's estate from a telegraph office in Manchester. It was logged as a message from a man identifying himself as Edwin. That alone meant nothing. But upon deeper inspection, the office was located near a well-known printing press that employed dozens, including traveling clerks and archivists. The call was made from a public phone booth, but what stood out was that the press had recently hired a new employee, one Mr. Percival Hinton. The name didn't match anything in the records, but something about it struck Harold. He dug deeper, reviewed the payroll, and found the signature for Mr. Hinton's hiring papers. The handwriting was eerily similar to Gregory Hale's from the police file. Harold's pulse quickened. The inspector quietly traveled to Manchester, posing as a trade consultant. He visited the press, asked to speak with management under the guise of conducting a regional employment audit. When handed the employee register, one name caught his eye again: Percival Hinton. Age matched. Background vague. No known relatives. No references. But Harold didn't act right away. He knew Gregory, if this truly was him, was clever, patient, and always one step ahead. A wrong move would send him running again. So instead, he arranged to meet a man named Piers Bennett, who often mentioned in passing to Gregory's mother. Piers worked at a nearby courier service and lived with his wife in a small flat on the outskirts of town. Harold visited the couple under the pretense of needing a parcel rerouted to Leeds. He noticed the photographs on the mantel; none included Piers or his wife. Odd, in an age where photography had become a beloved hobby for many. When Harold casually brought up recent news from Yorkshire, Piers stiffened. His wife changed the subject. That was enough. Harold discreetly followed Piers over the next week. One evening, Piers entered a dimly lit tavern in the industrial district and met a man wearing a thick coat and wide-brimmed hat. They spoke briefly before the man disappeared out the back. Harold managed to snap a quick image using a concealed camera. When developed, the face, though slightly turned, matched the old sketches of Gregory Hale. The net had closed. Harold waited for the perfect moment. On a rainy evening, as the man who called himself Percival Hinton stepped out of the press office, coat pulled high and collar tight, two constables approached him quietly. No dramatic chase. No protest. Just a quiet surrender. Years of running. Years of shadows. And at last, the ghost of that old Yorkshire winter had a name again. Gregory Hale, once a lover, once a fugitive, was now just a man, standing silent in the rain. The local authorities had started to notice a strange pattern. Eleanor's mother, a quiet, elderly woman living in the outskirts of Blackridge, was known to speak frequently with a man named Peter Callahan. This seemingly innocent connection took on a more sinister tone when investigators discovered that Peter and a woman named Marianne had 2 children together. That detail alone wouldn't have meant much, until the police began to wonder, could Peter Callahan actually be Eleanor? The idea seemed outrageous at first. But as the officers sifted through years of files and started to piece together fragments of forgotten lives, a strange picture began to emerge. They remembered that during Eleanor's brief stint as a high school volleyball coach nearly 2 decades ago, he had broken a finger on his right hand, the one most people wore rings on. The injury had healed badly, leaving the finger slightly bent at the joint. It was a small, barely noticeable detail, but one that stuck in the minds of a few officers. On a gray morning in late October, 2 detectives made their way to the customer support offices of a mid-sized shipping company in the coastal town of Almsworth. They were responding to an anonymous tip. A receptionist at the office later reported that she informed Mr. Callahan, Peter, that 2 men had arrived asking to speak with him. When Peter stepped into the small reception room, one of the officers reached out for a handshake. As their hands met, the detective caught sight of the bent finger. "Tobias," the officer said flatly, eyes locked on Peter's, "your game is over." Peter froze. The name Tobias, his old name, sliced through him like cold steel. His posture faltered. In that moment, everything changed. It all traced back to one critical mistake. Tobias's mobile phone had stopped working the day before. Concerned for his aging mother, he had used the office landline to try to reach her. It was an instinctive, hurried decision. But it led the authorities directly to him. That single call was all they needed. If Tobias had not dialed from that office phone, it's possible he might have never been caught. The police later uncovered that Tobias's mother had been speaking to him using a second mobile phone, one quietly registered in the name of a distant cousin. That number had eluded investigators for months. After the arrest, Tobias was escorted back to the city of Holberton, where he eventually confessed. There, in a dim interrogation room, he unraveled the tale of how he had taken his wife's life. With calm, almost distant words, he revealed what had happened. After committing the murder, Tobias fled north to the mining town of Darnham. He approached a longtime friend there, asking for her hand in marriage. She rejected him without hesitation. He stayed a few weeks, drifting, hiding. Eventually, he made his way to the capital, where he took up a job as a junior clerk. It was in that city that he met Marianne, a gentle woman who believed he had no family, no past, no name, just a lonely man trying to rebuild. They grew close. Over time, love bloomed. They married quietly, and by 2009, the 2 of them relocated to Almsworth, where Tobias, now living as Peter Callahan, found steady work. What baffled authorities was that even Marianne knew him by that name. How had he forged such a convincing identity? Digging deeper, the police found that Tobias had a childhood friend, Paul Callahan. After the murder, Tobias had stayed with Paul for several days. During that time, he had quietly scanned all of Paul's identification documents, driver's license, utility bills, old tax papers. Using these, he created a new identity. The photos were his own, but the name, the birth date, the past, all belonged to Paul. With that, Peter Callahan was born. And for 15 years, Tobias lived in the shadow of this name. He raised a family, made friends, paid taxes, and went unnoticed. He eluded justice not through grand deception or high-level forgery, but through the quiet consistency of an unremarkable life. It was the landline call, simple, forgettable, that unraveled the entire web. That was one case. But there's another, one that chilled the city of Windermere to its core in the summer of 1911. Back then, Windermere was a peaceful town. Clean streets, blooming gardens, and polite neighbors. In the district of Ravenshill, lived a woman named Margaret Davenforth. She was 42, elegant, educated, and well-connected. She lived with her 21-year-old daughter Annabelle and her 70-year-old mother Florence. The Davenport family resided in a grand, ivy-covered home at the corner of Hillcrest Lane, known among locals for its stunning rose garden and quiet grace. Margaret had been part of a successful trade syndicate, a sort of early network marketing operation that specialized in handcrafted goods from across the empire. She was one of their senior agents. Her husband, Edward, worked as a regional bank manager in East Darlow, about a day's ride away. The two had agreed to live separately for a while due to work commitments, and Margaret had moved back to Windermere with her mother and daughter only a few months before. On the morning of June 13th, something seemed off. No one had seen or heard from the Davenport household. The shutters were drawn. No morning tea deliveries were picked up. A neighbor, Mrs. Penelope Aldwick, happened to walk by and noticed something strange near the garden gate. Faint, smeared footprints, reddish in color. Her heart skipped. She knocked on the door. No answer. She called out. Silence. Curious and increasingly anxious, she moved toward the side window and peered inside. What she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. All three women, Margaret, Annabelle, and Florence, were lying on the floor in the parlor. Blood had pooled around them. It was as if time had frozen inside the house. Nothing moved. No noise, no flicker of life. Mrs. Aldwick stumbled backward and screamed for help. Police arrived within the hour. What they found was a home that had not been broken into, no signs of forced entry, no valuables missing, and no evidence of a struggle. Everything pointed to one chilling fact: the women likely knew their killer. The investigation stretched on for weeks. Suspects came and went. The family had no known enemies. Their servants were loyal and had alibis. Letters, financial records, and family histories were scrutinized. One detail, however, remained disturbing. Margaret had recently written to a colleague, expressing concern over a man from her past, a man who had once proposed marriage to her but had been rejected. His name? Tobias Gellard. It would be nearly a year before authorities connected that name to Peter Callahan, the man arrested in Onsworth. And so, two stories intertwined, one of evasion, and one of tragedy. A man who had taken lives, stolen identities, and vanished into the folds of society. For over a decade, he walked among people as someone else, a ghost with flesh. But in the end, it was not violence or vengeance that undid him. It was a single phone call, made out of love for a mother he could no longer protect. And that was all it took. The quiet town of Wetherby, nestled in the heart of Yorkshire, had never witnessed a crime so gruesome, so chilling, that it would etch itself into the memories of its people for generations. The townsfolk were used to the occasional petty theft, a drunken brawl at the local inn, or maybe a squabble over land. But this was something different. Something monstrous. Word began to spread like wildfire. Whispers turned into gasps. Eyes wide with disbelief. The Hartley residence, once a peaceful stone cottage on the edge of town, had become the center of a tragedy that would grip the entire region. By the time the town constable arrived with a few men, the narrow lane leading to the house was already teeming with villagers, curious, frightened, and unsure of what they were about to witness. Inside, the scene was harrowing. Three women, Lady Margaret Hartley, her young daughter Eliza, and her elderly mother-in-law Edith, lay lifeless, their bodies mutilated in ways that spoke of pure rage and cold calculation. The constables, hardened by their years in service, stood frozen for a moment before regaining composure. The air inside the house was thick, still, and reeked of blood and powder. The investigators quickly sealed off the home and began their initial inspection. 2 spent bullet shells were found embedded in the wooden floorboards, and it became evident that Lady Margaret had been shot point-blank in the head. Yet the second bullet, it was nowhere to be found. They searched high and low, beneath furniture, behind curtains, in walls, but it had simply vanished. With more questions than answers, they summoned the town's physician and forensic examiner, Dr. Whitmore, who began collecting evidence while the bodies were carefully transported for post-mortem examination. Within hours, grief turned into horror as the news spread beyond Weatherby, reaching nearby towns like Harrogate and York. The examination report painted a clearer, albeit more horrifying, picture. Young Eliza, barely 20, and her grandmother Edith, aged 72, had both succumbed to excessive blood loss, stab wounds covering their bodies, deep and deliberate. Only Margaret had died from the gunshot. The mystery of the second bullet remained. Meanwhile, pressure mounted from the public and Margaret's husband, Lord Henry Hartley, who had been away in London at the time of the attack. The townspeople, shaken and demanding justice, flooded the constabulary with their concern and outrage. The urgency to solve the crime could no longer be ignored. Multiple teams were formed. One dove into the family's personal correspondences and phone records, the modern equivalent of which, in those days, were letters, telegram logs, and household journals. Another team revisited the forensic evidence. And that's when they made a startling discovery. There was a fourth type of blood at the scene, blood that didn't belong to any of the victims. And this blood, they concluded, was from a man. It was now no longer just a case of robbery gone wrong. This was a planned attack. They uncovered a peculiar detail in Margaret's correspondence. There were frequent letters and telegram exchanges between her and someone named Anna Whitfield, an unfamiliar name in the community. The tone was casual, even friendly. Curious, the investigators began tracking Anna's whereabouts. It wasn't long before they found her near the old marketplace, withdrawing funds from a banker's window. Anna was brought in for questioning. At first, she seemed calm, even helpful. She expressed shock at the murders, claimed to have only known Margaret through a chance meeting at a local seamstress's boutique. She spoke of a brief friendship, of Margaret's charm and generosity. But something felt off. Her expressions were mismatched with her words, and her hands trembled ever so slightly. Under the weight of relentless questioning, Anna's facade began to crack. What she eventually confessed to shocked even the most seasoned officers. Anna, a 23-year-old apprentice beautician from the poorer side of Leeds, had always dreamt of living a life far removed from her humble roots. Her father, a cart driver, could barely afford to put bread on the table, let alone fund Anna's ambitions of starting her own salon. But Anna had charm, wit, and a dangerous determination. It was during this time of desperation that she met Margaret. Their meeting was not entirely accidental, as Anna had claimed. She had seen Margaret several times before, always adorned in expensive brooches and glimmering jewelry, stepping out of fine carriages in the town square. Anna had watched her, envied her, and plotted. She deliberately orchestrated a casual run-in, dropping a small mirror to attract Margaret's attention. The two struck up a conversation, and Anna played her part perfectly, charming, naive, eager to learn. She expressed interest in Margaret's work, feigned admiration, and earned her trust. But the plan wasn't hers alone. Anna had a lover, a young man named Thomas Blythe. He was handsome, sly, and equally desperate. Their love was passionate, but it was also rooted in a shared hunger, for wealth, for recognition, for escape. Together, they conspired. Margaret, with her lack of male presence at home, was the perfect target. An older woman, a daughter, and a frail grandmother, what threat could they pose? Thomas, emboldened by greed, agreed to execute the plan. He obtained a revolver from a local smuggler named Miles, the third man in their unholy pact. The night of the crime, under the veil of darkness, they entered the Hartley residence. What they hadn't anticipated was Eliza's courage. She fought back. And during the struggle, Thomas was wounded, a deep gash along his shoulder, which explained the fourth blood type. But rage overpowered fear. He stabbed Edith and Eliza repeatedly. Margaret tried to escape, but a bullet silenced her cries. In the chaos, the second bullet fired missed its target and embedded itself somewhere the police hadn't looked, inside the thick tapestry that hung behind the fireplace, discovered later during a follow-up inspection. With Anna's confession, and a blood trail that matched Thomas's wound, the police began their hunt for him. But by then, he had vanished, last seen boarding a mail coach headed north. And so, the story of the Hartley murders came to light, not through forensic genius alone, but through betrayal, greed, and the dark lengths people will go to for a taste of a better life. What remained was an entire town grieving 3 lives, questioning the faces of those they thought they knew, and wondering how such evil could ever find its way to their doorstep. In the early spring of 1893, nestled in the quiet outskirts of Lark Hollow, a small town deep in the English countryside, Evelyn Hawthorne was preparing for what she thought would be a promising business opportunity. She had recently become involved in a women-led commerce collective that promised prosperity for enterprising ladies. Evelyn, a gentle widow living with her aging mother and teenage daughter, felt hopeful for the first time in years. On the morning of March 3, Evelyn received a letter from a woman named Clara Norwood, expressing interest in joining her collective. Clara had been referred by a distant acquaintance and appeared eager to participate. What Evelyn didn't know was that Clara had a hidden motive, carefully laid out in secret correspondence with her lover, Edwin Burke. Clara arrived at the Hawthorne estate the next morning, under the pretense of needing help with registration for the collective. She appeared nervous, unfamiliar with the forms, and asked Evelyn if she could call upon a friend for assistance. Evelyn, always kind and trusting, agreed without hesitation. Within the hour, Edwin arrived with another man named Matthew Crowley. They were well-dressed, polite, outwardly unthreatening. Evelyn welcomed them in. But no sooner had Edwin stepped through the doorway than he revealed a pistol from under his coat and pointed it directly at Evelyn. Without a word, he pulled the trigger. The shot echoed faintly in the thick stone walls of the old house, muffled enough that the neighbors didn't hear, but it reached the ears of Evelyn's daughter, Lillian, and her elderly mother, Eleanor, who were in the sitting room down the hall. As they rushed toward the sound, they found Clara standing silently, eyes wide, as Edwin and Matthew turned to them. Edwin ordered them to stay quiet and demanded Eleanor's coin purse and access to her savings. Terrified, Eleanor handed over her bank passbook and key. But things took a darker turn. Edwin and Matthew began whispering urgently to each other. Eleanor and Lillian had seen their faces. There was no going back. Clara stood frozen as Edwin raised his gun once more, aiming for Lillian. He fired, but in the chaos, the bullet missed and hit his own foot. He cried out, collapsing against the wall. Furious and in pain, Edwin shouted at Matthew, who then attacked Eleanor and Lillian with a knife he had concealed in his coat. The struggle was short and brutal. Within minutes, 3 generations of the Hawthorne family lay lifeless on the floor of their own home. The trio ransacked the house, stealing a fortune in heirloom jewelry, silver cutlery, and over £1,000 from the family's hidden lockbox. As they fled, Clara took Eleanor's bank key, planning to withdraw the remaining funds later that evening. But fate didn't smile on the murderers for long. Clara was the first to be caught. When she arrived at the local bank attempting to withdraw funds, the teller recognized the elderly Hawthorne matriarch's account and grew suspicious. He stalled her, discreetly sent for the constables, and within the hour Clara was under arrest. Edwin, meanwhile, had limped into a small-town infirmary with a self-inflicted gunshot wound, spinning a tale of a highway robbery. But his story crumbled when local constables found inconsistencies in his report. His clothes had dried blood that matched samples taken from the crime scene. A closer examination confirmed the truth: he had been at the Hawthorne estate. Matthew tried to flee to the northern coast but was captured after a witness reported seeing him boarding a coach with a suspiciously bloodied bag. Inside were Eleanor's monogrammed brooches and a blood-stained blade. The townsfolk of Lark Hollow were stunned. The Hawthorne family was beloved. Evelyn had taught Sunday school, Eleanor was known for her herbal remedies, and Lillian was just weeks away from her university exams. Their sudden, violent end cast a shadow over the entire region. The trial that followed drew crowds from across the country. It was the first time in Westfordshire's history that a woman stood trial alongside 2 men for a triple homicide. Clara's calm demeanor in the courtroom shocked the public, especially after testimonies revealed she had orchestrated the entry into the home. In December 1895, the court sentenced all three to death by hanging. Public reaction was mixed. Some were horrified that a woman would receive the same fate as her male counterparts, while others insisted justice had been done. Years later, Edwin's final written confession would be discovered, tucked inside a hollow wall of his prison cell. In it, he described how greed had overtaken his judgment and how, in a moment of weakness, he had thrown away not only his life but the lives of innocent women. Clara Norwood remains one of the few women in British history to be executed for orchestrating a domestic murder. The Hawthorne estate was never sold. Locals say the house stands empty to this day, cloaked in ivy and silence, the past lingering in the air like dust. Visitors who dare to peer through its broken windows claim they hear whispers, or the faint sound of a piano Lillian once played in the parlor. And so the story of the Hawthorne tragedy became a cautionary tale in Lark Hollow, a reminder of how deception can hide behind a friendly smile, and how the thirst for riches can destroy even the most innocent of lives. It was the winter of 1893 in the quiet English town of Norbury, a place where nothing ever really happened, until the day Eleanor Wentworth vanished. Her brother, Thomas Wentworth, grew concerned when days passed without any word from her. She had always written, even if only a short note. At first, he tried to reach her through the few neighbors she had in the town's edge, but none had seen her recently. So, Thomas traveled to her home, a small cottage just past the church, tucked behind a row of overgrown hedges. When he knocked, her husband, Gregory Whitmore, opened the door only slightly and stood firmly in the gap, refusing to let Thomas inside. Gregory claimed Eleanor had gone to stay with a distant aunt in Derbyshire, but his vague answers didn't sit right with Thomas. He had a gut feeling that something was terribly wrong. He left, but not quietly. Thomas walked straight to the Norbury Constabulary and filed a report. His sister was missing, and he feared foul play. The constable on duty, Inspector Lawrence Briggs, took the matter seriously. Eleanor had never been the sort to disappear. And Gregory Whitmore? Well, people said he was a clever man but not a kind one. The next morning, the inspector and two officers rode to the Whitmore residence. Gregory's face paled at the sight of them. His hands trembled slightly as he invited them in, but when questioned, his responses were evasive, circular. He couldn't, or wouldn't, say when Eleanor had left, what she had packed, or even what train she had supposedly taken. Something was clearly amiss. Inspector Briggs asked to take a look around the house. Gregory hesitated but knew he had no legal way to refuse. The search began. They scoured the drawing room, the cellar, the kitchen, nothing out of place. But when they reached the back of the house, they found a locked pantry Gregory claimed he used for storing perishables. A faint hum came from within. When they finally got the door open, it revealed an old commercial icebox, an unusually large one for a household of 3. That's when things began to unravel. Inside the icebox were several oilskin parcels, each tied meticulously with twine. The packages were stacked neatly, too neatly. When one of the constables opened one, the air filled with the unmistakable, metallic tang of blood. Inside were pieces of what appeared to be flesh, human flesh. Another parcel revealed something even more horrifying, part of a human skull, the scalp still clinging to it in patches. Gregory collapsed to his knees and broke into sobs. Through his tears, he admitted what he had done. The remains were, he said, all that was left of Eleanor. He was arrested on the spot. Over the next week, under questioning, Gregory spilled the entire grim tale. He had met Eleanor during their years at Cambridge, where he was studying chemistry and she was pursuing literature. At first, their connection had been electric. They married in 1889 and moved to Norbury 2 years later. Gregory opened a modest apothecary, and Eleanor adjusted to the slow rhythm of provincial life. But things weren't perfect. Eleanor had ambitions. She wanted to write, to travel, to teach. Gregory, however, was controlling. He didn't approve of her leaving home too often, didn't like the way she corresponded with her old university friends. Their arguments became routine, and tension lived in the walls of their home. In 1892, Eleanor gave birth to twin daughters. For a while, their household calmed. But the peace was short-lived. Gregory's business suffered, and he grew bitter. Eleanor had begun writing again, sending manuscripts to publishers in London. She was beginning to feel hopeful, but Gregory saw her independence as defiance. One afternoon, during yet another argument, Eleanor told him she wanted a separation. She no longer wished to live under his control. That was the breaking point. Gregory claimed that he didn't mean to kill her. That day, October 16, 1893, they argued again in the bedroom. She threatened to leave him, to take the girls. Enraged, he shoved her. She stumbled, struck her head on the iron bedpost, and collapsed. Blood pooled quickly beneath her hair. He said he panicked. But instead of calling for help, Gregory sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her still form. Minutes passed. Then he stood, picked up a pillow, and pressed it over her face until she stopped breathing. From there, the tale grew darker. With the girls at school and only a few hours before they returned, Gregory dragged Eleanor's body to the scullery and locked the door. That night, he lay awake, his thoughts racing. The next morning, he traveled to the next town and purchased a large icebox from a butcher going out of business. He also procured cutting tools from the blacksmith, a bone saw, chisels, wrapping cloth. Over the next 2 days, he dismembered his wife's body into dozens of pieces, 72, he later claimed, and wrapped them meticulously. He hid the icebox in the pantry, swearing to himself he'd dispose of the parcels gradually in the nearby river. But the task was too great, and fear paralyzed him. Days passed. Weeks. The body remained hidden behind a locked door. The children never knew. He told them Eleanor had traveled to care for a sick aunt. And he carried on as if nothing had happened. Neighbors grew suspicious when Eleanor didn't return. When the questions became too frequent, he avoided them. But he hadn't expected Thomas to press so hard, nor for the police to take such swift action. In court, Gregory showed little emotion. His confession was read aloud in silence, broken only by gasps from the gallery. The judge granted the prosecution's request for remand and ordered a full psychiatric evaluation. The case would haunt Norbury for generations. They buried what they could recover of Eleanor Wentworth in the local churchyard. Her daughters, too young to understand the full gravity, were taken in by her sister's family. And Gregory Whitmore, once the quiet apothecary, was remembered not for his business nor his studies, but as the man who butchered his wife and stored her remains in ice. Some say the house still stands, and that on cold winter nights, you can hear Eleanor's voice through the pantry door, whispering for someone to finally open it.